Well, welcome back to the Red Nation podcast, Vijay. How's it going?
Well, it's great to be with you. We had such a great time last time. I just remember laughing through the whole interview, so I'm happy to be back. I hope we're laughing this time as well.
Well, I think, the first question on everyone's mind if they pick up your book is how did you get Evo Morales to write the introduction?
Well, Evo Morales Aima was the most recent person who was overthrown by essentially Washington bullets. The coup d'etat of November 2019, it sort of opened a window to all past coups, assassinations, suffocations by the United States government. And in many ways, if I'm completely honest with you, the book was written in a way against those who believed this was not a coup. I hadn't
Hmm.
started writing the book before December, and I had him right in mind when I was writing the whole book. And he looked like a figure who had so many predecessors. Going back to Arbenz in Guatemala in '54, Allende in Chile '73, and then people whose names are not so familiar in Thailand, in Indonesia, and so on. So I was very keen that the book, in a way, pay due respect to what had happened to him. And so I approached them and said, "Here's the book." And our friends in Argentina, where he is based now, approached him and he read the manuscript and wrote the preface. And I was very heartened to read what he had written because, I think he felt that this is indeed his story and this is the prehistory of what happened in Bolivia in November 2019. It's a prehistory, yes. It's also a process that seems unabated, which is the battle between the forces of decolonization, of which he is a major figure in that process of decolonization, and the forces of imperialism, centered around Washington D.C. and its bullets.
Right. And reading this book, one can't help see those contemporary parallels, especially the way that the news media in the United States set up Evo Morales, for this coup. And I remember I was actually in Caracas when he was reelected in October 23rd, 2019, and actually had the privilege of meeting David Checojuenca, who was one of his who used to run his foreign ministry. And David Checojuenca, he's a very humble indigenous man. Like when we talked to him, he didn't talk about politics. He didn't talk about anything. He said, "Hey, we're having a prayer, on the winter solstice. You should come down to La Paz, and we're gonna pray for world peace." He was just a humble man who was very religious, very spiritual, and I just remember shaking his hand and going up to my room that night and reading the news about what was taking place in Bolivia, and having this really sick feeling in my stomach that perhaps this was the last time that I was going to see this guy, because things were looking bad already. And I've only had that feeling, when I've had friends who have been targeted, by police, for the Standing Rock uprisings and everything like that, and seeing them, spend several years in jail for the resistance. But I couldn't help but see those kind of parallels, because myself was, my own political journey was very much influenced by Evo Morales. He represented a lot. He was, to many of us, he was, the president of indigenous America. And there's this part of the book that I think is incredibly important, and you call it the 9 chapters in the regime change manual. I'll just go through them, and maybe we can talk about some of these points because it really highlights the character of this book and what you're actually talking about, which is, it's a very dark book. I'll just warn people with that. I didn't walk away having a really good feeling, but at the same time I walked away knowing a lot more. But the first chapter, you say lobby public opinion. The second one is appoint the right man on the ground. Number three is make sure the generals are ready. Number four, make the economy scream. Five, diplomatic isolation. Six, organize mass protests. Seven, the green light. At 8, a study of assassination. And 9, deny. And number 9 is, I think, is really important, especially when we look at the Bolivian coup, because any criticism of the liberal state is automatically considered conspiratorial. And what you're really revealing in this book is a conspiracy by the ruling class. And maybe you could elaborate a little bit on each of these 9 chapters of the regime change manual that you lay out.
Yeah, so you see, what I was very much thinking, what was at the forefront of my mind was how to introduce to people in the present the very complex use of force. And by complex use of force, I mean the range of force, from diplomatic pressure to economic force, and only at the end, really, military force. And even military force comes in a range. There's sabotage operations, there's trying to get a military to mutiny or to move against a government, and then there could be a foreign military intervention. It's a range of techniques and processes that take place to suffocate adversary. So it's very hard to explain to people that there is this, because what you're fighting against is exactly the very process that you're trying to reveal. In other words, part of the process you're trying to reveal is an ideological process where
Mhm.
the forces of imperialism construct what they're doing in a benevolent way. In other words, they will say that we're going into a country to save the country from anarchy, from communists, from genocidal maniacs, and so on. So the forces of imperialism conduct such a swift and strong ideological battle. Because of various reasons, they are able to actually paint their adversary as a very great threat to the planet. And once you've done that, it becomes hard for us to reach people and say, wait a minute, let's look at it from a different perspective. You can't start with the attitude, you can't start with the stance that US intervention or US policy towards another country is benevolent. I'm not saying that you should start by saying it's malevolent either, but start by looking at the interests, why this is happening, and so on. In the UN Charter, there's a standard for intervening across borders. If one country or a set of countries wants to put pressure on another country, the standard has to be that that country, has a government which is in some ways being genocidal towards the population or a part of the population. Once you have that standard met, you can prove that the government is being genocidal towards a part of the population, then chapters 6 and 7 of the UN Charter get triggered. Chapter 6 has a whole range of techniques, again, diplomatic pressure, economic pressure, and so on. Chapter 7 allows for military force. Now, the problem with the way the United States exercises its power is it actually doesn't have a standard. It doesn't have to show why a government is to be overthrown. It doesn't have to show that Hugo Chavez, is conducting something against international law. They just depict the person as being a problem. So whether it's the government of North Korea or the government in Iran or it's Venezuela, Cuba, whatever, it's a kind of unilateral assertion made by the United States that this government needs to be overthrown. It doesn't have to make an argument, because underneath the assertion is the claim that the US government is benevolent in its actions, and that those that it paints as threats are malevolent. If you accept that structure, it's very hard to explain to people that, well, in fact, there's a whole project that goes into making the person that the US government wants to overthrow malevolent. There's a whole process. What I decided was to take a coup, which nobody denies, which is the US coup against the government in Guatemala. What typically happens from a liberal historian or scholar's point of view is that they say, well, in Guatemala, the US, well, maybe we can admit that the US exceeded its mandate, shouldn't have overthrown the government. After all, Mr. Arbenz was a moderate and he was just conducting some modest land reform and so on. But I disagree with that entirely. I think what Arbenz was doing was opening a project of resource socialism where
Mhm.
countries that were decolonizing were trying to reclaim their resources for their people. And the US government rightly feared that if Arbenz puts the squeeze on United Fruit in Guatemala, that policy might spread to Honduras, where the Honduran people might get confidence and say, look, it happened in Guatemala. We need to eject United Fruit. This may move further south to Panama, where the Panamanian people say, hey, listen, this canal is ours. We need to claim higher rents. We're not going to allow the US to control it, and so on. So the US government actually acts in its interest, its correct interest, its imperialist interest to overthrow the government in Guatemala. Then comes the process of this, delegitimizing the government, using diplomatic pressure to show that the government is not got the respect of other countries. And eventually this escalates into financing sections in the country to start doing popular protests. This is a very key and very old established policy by the US government to utilize, for instance, US trade unions, as they did in Guyana, to finance and to train trade unions in Guyana to oppose communism. And then, when need be, you sort of trigger those trade unions to go out on strike. This is what they did in the Dominican Republic as well. They funded trade unions and used mass protests as an instrument against a government. And the government had a hard time because it was, after all, a trade union that was objecting to what's happening in the government. Trade unions are a key part of the left, but not if their leadership has been bought and paid for by what a British diplomat called not the AFL-CIO but the AFL-CIA, because the
Hmm.
AFL-CIO was being used by the CIA through various cutouts, to finance these trade union leaders, build them up, give them money to dole out to others, and so on. So I wanted to go through, these nine different, basically aspects of how a coup or regime change is conducted. It's not just that the military leaves the barracks. Nothing is as simple as that. In fact, we know that in Chile, the military made it clear to the United States quite early that, look, we don't want to act against the government of Allende because we don't have the cover of mass protests. And this is then the role of the man on the ground, the US ambassador, who makes very close connections with right wing political parties, fascistic groups, and so on, and starts to engineer mass protests. You see, from far away, particularly if the New York Times correspondent is bought and paid for, which had been the case for many years, and perhaps is still the case, we just don't know exactly. But then the reporter will say, well, there was a demonstration in front of the presidential palace. They're not necessarily going to say these are a bunch of fascists demonstrating in front of the palace. In Bolivia in November 2019, there were indeed fascists on the street with their fascist emblems and their fascist insignias and so on, making a fascist demonstration against Evo Morales. But in the Western press, it was covered as mass protests of the people against Morales. The political character of the protests was not, out there in public. And the last point, which I have in these 9 chapters, is deny. This is, of course, a well-known, principle of these coup d'états, that when a coup happens, when there's U.S. involvement, the United States denies that it had any role. It says, of course not. We are innocent of any role. Then 20, 30 years later, we'll find out that they had, in fact, much more than a minimal role. They, in fact, helped engineer the coup. We learned this in Brazil. We learned this in Brazil 1964. We learned this consistently over time. And there's a kind of naivete that gets set up. You say, okay, we'll accept the US government overthrew Mossadegh in Iran in 53. We accept that. But, let's face it, in the present moment, the US government doesn't behave like that. Well, why are you so sure of that? And it's that naivete that keeps, allowing history to reproduce itself. This is a kind of liberal naivete which happened when Morales was overthrown. There were sections of the liberals and the Western left that said, well, this is not a coup because Morales made mistakes. I mean,
Hmm.
how is that even possible, that you can blank off sections of your brain, your clear understanding of the past from the present?
You and I have both been called vulgar anti-imperialists for pointing out that the overthrow of Morales was in large part due to his path of resource nationalism or resource socialism, and trying to essentially de-link Bolivia from the global capitalist supply chain that really privileges the North. And it's just funny because if you look at these 9 studies, I think these 9 kind of chapters that you're talking about, you really locate, I think, the heart of the matter, which is a sense of historical amnesia, or like the willful projection of a past or present, of like current violences, labeling somebody like Evo Morales as an authoritarian, somebody who refused to give up power. He was, power hungry. He was a sexist. He was a machismo. All of these things. Even in the New York Times, you had one columnist citing a U.S. backed NGO that accused Evo Morales of genocide. This was leading up into the months before the coup, and what I really appreciate about this book is that you ground those kinds of sentiments and that willful kind of psychological warfare, as you call it, in a longer history of historical amnesia, tracing the US imperialist project is essentially a counter revolutionary project that began in 1776 that was against the abolition of slavery and for the westward expansion into indigenous territories, west of the Allegheny Mountains into the Ohio River Valley, which is an incredibly, important assertion. And oftentimes within anti-imperialist circles, especially in North America, those two connections aren't really made. The so-called domestic, territorial acquisition of the United States and its imperialist agenda abroad. And specifically, what hinges on this is the Monroe Doctrine. And I was wondering if you can maybe walk us through that early U.S. history and how it connects to the broader imperialist project that unfolded within the 20th and 21st centuries.
You see, one interesting fallacy is that imperialism requires a country to cross an ocean or its border, as it were, for an imperialist project to be manifest. And the United States government has since 1776 used a certain interpretation of the American, so-called revolution to position itself as a anti-colonial project. That they somehow fought against British colonialism, got their freedom, and then were a country founded on freedom or liberty. This is a self description of the US project, and therefore you can then utilize the residue of that liberation project forever. You can say, well, we are not for colonialism because we were, in fact, founded against colonialism. Well, if you look closely at the American Revolution, firstly, it was not really a revolution. It wasn't a mass struggle of the toiling people, which would have included people who had been enslaved, serfs, and others. This was, in a sense, a bourgeois revolution of landed planters who had these big factory fields. It was of urban artisans and others, and there was some mass character, obviously, but they didn't say bring in the enslaved people to fight against the British. This is not like how Simon Bolivar had to make a deal, when he returned from exile and said, I'm going to, emancipate people from enslavement as part of the project to liberate the continent and so on. There was no such statement made by George Washington. That would have changed the character of what was happening in the 13 colonies. They didn't make that statement. In fact, one of the key demands, two of the key demands you've mentioned already. One was to expand enslavement. This was a key thing. Inside Britain, in the parliament, there had been a debate started up by the abolitionists. That was objectionable, particularly in the colonies at the south of the 13 colonies. But the second thing is actually much more key, which was the desire to go westward. To go westward, of course, meant a war against all the native nations, to go to war against the peoples who lived there, who populated that area, who had built their lives for, a very long period of time. It meant, of course, a war against Mexico, when at least a third of Mexico was seized by the United States and brought into this large territorial expanse that goes from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean. I mean, what is this period from 1776 to 1850s except a project of settler colonialism? That's what this is. It defines itself. Now, there are people who say there is no imperialism until 1898 because they will take the US war against the Spanish Empire, in the Philippines, in Puerto Rico, in Cuba, and so on. They'll take that as the starting point. I think that's to miss something very significant, which was the territorial expansion. which included the war against Mexico. What is that war? How do you understand that war and the conquest of the territory except through the lens of something like settler colonialism? In other words, US imperialism for a very long period and from the founding of the United States is about expanding on the continent principally. And then after 1898, yes, there are these territories created. But listen, between the 1820s and 1898, the United States intervenes decidedly in Central America and in parts of South America. The Monroe Doctrine of 1823 is not put forward as, again, a benevolent doctrine. It's about establishing, the hemisphere as a place where the European colonies could not, European colonialists could not come and interfere. In fact, it's a very interesting, period, because at this time the United States was intervening in the Greek war and had intervened, in Morocco against the so-called Barbary pirates. So it's not like the US was saying, you keep Europe and the Mediterranean, we'll keep the Americas. The US already had a global ambition, and this is before 1898. So I've never really understood why canonical historians start, the US imperial or empire. They don't like to use the word imperialism. Why they like to start that at 1898? I think you miss actually the core issue, which is that the project of the United States of America was in fact always already an imperialist project.
Yeah, that's. I mean, it's an important point that I think often goes misunderstood, and it also goes back to one of the points that you make is as far as like Western and primarily U.S. journalists working for these major outlets then become stenographers of the State Department. And I think of as somebody who's been trained in U.S. history in a very conservative school of U.S. history, I would also say that one of the failures of U.S. historians is to adequately narrate the history of the United States to the rest of the world, because the US history project itself is a propaganda project that is deeply invested in keeping those myths that you are unpacking in there. There's oftentimes a discouragement, or discouraged historians are discouraged from making kind of those critical links between so-called domestic policy and foreign policy and how they inform each other. I want to return to a point that you make early on in the book, and you use this very evocative language, the preponderant power, which is something that was developed or theorized by Paul Nitze. I don't know if I'm saying his name correctly, but he was the Deputy Secretary of Defense, and he saw the utility of the nuclear bomb and kind of exerting U.S. Power throughout the globe. And the word, as you define it, this is a quotation from your book. The word preponderant comes from Latin. It means to weigh more. The king is always worth his weight in gold. Now the United States claims the scale. Its weight bolstered by the payloads dropped over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The divine to rule it's basically the divine right to rule without the people's consent. Can you unpack this a little bit and how this became a kind of hegemonic foreign policy doctrine post World War II for the United States?
Yeah, when I first saw the term preponderance, the word preponderance, it was in a text from 1993, actually. It
Hmm.
was a US Joint Chiefs of Staff memorandum on joint operations. I was interested in that memorandum because I had seen another term I'd never encountered before called interoperability. And that means where the US military comes to one of its subordinate allies, and they do military exercises together in order to bring those countries' military into the command structure of the U.S. Navy or Air Force or Army. In other words, you'll create a interoperability where those militaries will become part of an extension of the U.S. military. It's not like the Indian Navy is commanding U.S. troops. It's always the other way around. And in that, there was the word preponderance, and it was used just in descriptive way. I was puzzled by it, and I tried to learn about it. And in trying to learn about the term, I came upon this, use of it in a memorandum from 1952. where Nietzsche talks about exercising preponderant power, and he there talks about the exercise of it over Western Europe. That was interesting. It hadn't occurred to me that that would be the place in which one would see it. Exercise over Western Europe, but in fact, when you go and study this carefully, um, the use of power over Western Europe was established by preventing the left from coming to power in France, in Italy, and in Germany, and ensuring that the conservative right wing, sometimes fascists, came to power in place of the left. The Americans put money in there, sabotaged the left, paid trade unions, and so on to turn their backs on the communist movement. That was how they exercised preponderant power in Western Europe. But Nietzsche in that memorandum has this very evocative, unforgettable line. He says, preponderant power must be the objective of US policy. You got to remember that Paul Nietzsche is not like a fascistic right wing kind of guy. This is a mainline liberal who,
Hmm.
in fact, was very much troubled by the US use of the atom bomb in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And yet here is this mainline liberal, who becomes a pillar of the US State Department. Through his career, he helped shape the formation of the modern State Department. He has put it right out there in a memorandum that the United States is not in a community of nations. That's not the U.S. policy. To better establish the UN, to have a community of nations, to create a world in which multilateralism and all the words of the United Nations and its charter, all those words are set aside. And he says it directly. Our objective is we must be the first country in the world. We must dominate the world. That's incredible. That's something incredible. And that should give the lie to those who believe that the United States exercises power benevolently. Because I think if you take the words of people like Nietzsche seriously, then the US exercises power to maintain its hegemony over the world. It uses its force to have preponderant power. That seems to me a self definition of what the United States is doing. I don't need to overinterpret that line, it says it all. And it's curious that after having this in the public domain, where there's a very clear cut statement, and then from Nietzsche, who's a liberal, all the way out to Trump, who quite directly says the point is that the United States should be the dominant power in the world. It's quite extraordinary that so many people continue to believe that US power is exercised benevolently. I mean, how could you believe that? The only reason I know lots of people accept that is that they accept it in a realist way. In other words, the United States is the most powerful military power in the world and is able to exercise force through the use of economic power. So better not rattle the cage. Don't disturb, the big dog in the room. Let the dog sleep. So keep saying that the dog is actually benevolent when the dog is just biting you. You don't want to somehow admit reality because you know that there's no point doing so. So people either naively believe that the United States exercises power benevolently, or cynically they will say that because they don't want to go on the wrong side of US power. But either way, this is it's a fog. We have it on record from a liberal in 1952 to a neo-fascistic fellow in 2020 that the aim of the United States military and its entire establishment of institutions is to maintain the United States in a position of preponderance over the rest of the planet. That seems to me something that people need to accept. And then you can have a debate about whether that's acceptable or it's unacceptable, whether this technique is along the grain of international law or not.
And perhaps the starkest illustration of this is when, in February 2019, President Trump issued an executive order creating the sixth branch of the military, the Space Force, to ensure unfettered access and freedom to operate in space by the United States. And by last December, it was formally established as a branch of the military. And I think it was, this February in his State of the Union, he says America has always been a frontier nation. Now we must brace the next frontier, America's manifest destiny in the stars. And then 2 months later, amid this surging pandemic, he issues an executive order granting the United States the preemptive right or the first monopoly claims to start mining the moon and asteroids. And I just think it may seem ridiculous in some sense, but he's literally projecting U.S. belligerence to the levels of the cosmos. And I think it just kind of gets at the core. Like it's not just an earthly concern. It's a cosmic concern of U.S. exceptionalism. Um, but I think the one of the main points that you make in this book, and I think it's really important, is that you really recast the narrative that the principal contradiction of the post World War II years is not along kind of the Cold War like binaries of the Soviet Union versus the United States, but it's more of a North South contradiction and an imperialist war against decolonization, and in an effort to reframe the so-called free world as the benevolent, benefactors of civilization, peace, and democracy. There becomes a part of that operation. There's a kind of cultural and political campaign to recast the Soviet, nations, or the Soviet, or excuse me, the USSR as imperialist, and this term Soviet imperialism comes out, and there's also an attempt to call the Soviets the new colonialists. And this happens, with also a deep association of communism with fascism. And, you have Hannah Arendt's book, Totalitarianism, which is comparing kind of the USSR's uh, uh, government with, that of Hitler's. And this is something that continues on today as far as the associations of communism with authoritarianism. But what's kind of missed in this is that this is a war that isn't really waged against the USSR per se, but it's more so waged against the nations of the global South who are participating in a decolonization movement. I was wondering if you could elaborate on that and the ramifications or the legacy of this anti-communism and how it warps our understanding of this so-called Cold War.
See, firstly, there's no doubt that from 1917 to 1989-90, the United States and Western Europe was existentially threatened by the existence first of the Soviet Republic and then the USSR, and wanted to overthrow that republic. I mean, when the Soviet Republic emerged after 1917, in fact, these Western countries invaded the territory in order to overthrow that government. We don't have to speculate about this. They not only said they wanted to overthrow the government, they tried to. But we also need to understand what the USSR was. It was also a force of decolonization.
Mm-hmm.
Immediately, Lenin and others talked about self determination. Each of the so called colonies of the Tsarist Empire, which again were contiguous with the empire, were made independent nations. You had Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, etc. They were all Soviet socialist republics, including Mongolia and so on. So there was a process of decolonization involved there. And from the 1920 Communist International meeting onward, the USSR pledged itself to end colonialism. I mean, this is a very important part of Soviet history. The USSR provided material support in anti colonial struggles, the USSR assisted them, and so on. And it's very clear that for its history, it took a stand against colonialism, whether it's in the United Nations and other places. I mean, the USSR helped formulate the Third World Project. Whether again it's in the non-aligned movement, whether it's in various other forums of the UN, and again it's providing material aid for development of military aid. So the USSR played a role in the camp of decolonization. That's very clear. United States played a role in the camp of recolonization. After World War II, there were countries like Vietnam, Indonesia, Malaya, Kenya, and so on that were fighting for decolonization, and the imperial powers came back and sought to recolonize them because they were taking them back either from the Japanese or they were taking them back from relative freedom during World War too, because the British were busy with fighting in the battlefields of Europe. And in these instances between the forces of decolonization and imperialism, United States always came on the side of the imperialists, and most dramatically, of course, in Vietnam, where the US comes in on the backs of the French to prosecute a long and brutal war against the Vietnamese people. But of course, you see this happening in South America as well. Any attempt by government to break the chains of colonialism, that attempt had to be crushed by the United States. And again, the test example of that is the Cuban Revolution, which is a revolution of people fighting against the colonial policies of the United States. The United States government never accepted that. So my feeling is that when you periodize from 1945 to the present, what you generally do is you say from 45 to 89, that was the Cold War. That I think is a designation that does not make sense to me. I prefer to see it from 1917 or maybe even from 1911, which is the Mexican Revolution, the revolution in Iran, and the revolution in China. From about 1911 to the present, there's been a long struggle between the forces of colonialism and the forces of decolonization. And this is actually a better major contradiction that explains this epoch. You otherwise, if everything is about the Cold War, from 45 to 89, the focus becomes back to Europe. And then there is a very callous way in which the rest of the world is called a battlefield, or places where proxy battles take place. It's not true. Angola was not a proxy battle. The fights in South America, not a proxy battle. Cuba is not a proxy battle. The Cuban people had a sovereign historical role in making their own revolution. And then they took assistance from the USSR when the United States embargoed them. They actively took assistance from the USSR, and they had a very fraught relationship with the USSR. They were not a colony of the USSR. That's a ridiculous way to see it. So, this Cold War framework privileges the Russians against the West, as if that's the only way to see things. No, no. You have to see things on a global scale, and then the principal contradiction is between the active and irresistible forces of decolonization against the older sclerotic forces of imperialism.
In previous books, such as like The Darker Nations, you say the third world project, third world is not a place, it's a project. And in this book, you elaborate a little bit more on not just the role of the Third World Project within the non-aligned movement, but also the role of the Tricontinental and the legitimate, threat it posed to, capitalist hegemony over the world. And it's something that is, I think, often forgotten again in this kind of Cold War binarism between the U.S. and the USSR. But can you elaborate a little bit more on the legacies of the Tricontinental, because you yourself are the director of the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research right now, very much a legacy of this particular period in time.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that question. I mean, the first thing I want to say broadly and theoretically is that I think there's been, in my opinion, a tendency in the historiographic literature to not take seriously the actual threat posed by the Third World Project to imperialism.
Mhm.
It's not that these are innocent people, in India and in wherever, Chile and Argentina. These are innocent people who were victimized by either the West or something. There's a tendency in left thinking of these countries as victims. I think this is completely wrong. These countries had posed a serious threat, a credible threat to imperialism, and they had their own ideas, they had their own project, and they were trying to put it forward. Now, the very fact that that project was defeated doesn't mean that they were not a threat. I think you should not read defeat as weakness. Defeats take place, but then you regroup and come back. In the middle of the Third World Project, there was a new dynamic that opened up in the 1960s, particularly after the Cuban Revolution had established itself, where there were national liberation movements, that included the movements against Portuguese colonialism in Africa. These included the Vietnamese, the Palestinians, and guerrilla struggles across Latin America that took the view that the process of decolonization had to be deepened. It could not merely be a state project, it had to be a popular project. it in many cases had to take up armed struggle against the local oligarchs backed by the US government. And this deepened and radicalized the third world project, challenged it. But I think again there's another error that comes up which says that there is a more conservative version of the third world project. In other words, the non-aligned movement founded 1961, and then the Tricontinental founded 66. I think this is another error because after all, the Cubans were there at the founding of the non-aligned movement in 1961. Dorticos was speaking at the non-aligned meeting. He was very much played a role there. You know, there's a this gap is made between the non-aligned movement on the one side, which is treated
Mhm.
as a more conservative, a moderate, project, and then the Tricontinental from 1966 seen as more radical. I think that distinction is not doesn't hold water that much because the Cubans were an integral part of the non-aligned movement. Dorticos was there in Belgrade in 1961 at the founding. Fidel Castro played a very key role in the NAM, in the debates in NAM and so on. And in 1973, at the non-aligned meeting in Algiers, it was a very radical debate around the new international economic order, around trying to transform the world system and so on. So I'm not of the view that one should say, oh, okay, one is more radical, one is more moderate. I think this was a process, and different countries had different class alignments and so on. But the emergence of the tricontinental in the 1960s played a role. I mean, it lifted up, for instance, the Palestinian struggle. It lifted it up. It gave it international prominence. The role the tricontinental played in making the Palestinian struggle a struggle of global importance is very significant. The role that it played in giving international support to Vietnam, very important. The Tricontinental took the struggle against Portuguese colonialism out of Africa and made it a world affair. It made Amilcar Cabral a figure of the international left. So it played an important and impressive role. Now, of course, only one meeting was held. There was a great debate at that meeting in 1966 in Havana around tactics, around strategy, and so on. But I still believe that it created a range of debate. What should be the approach of countries to imperialism, and the impact of that debate between the NAM on the one side and the Tricontinental on the other continues to this day. It's a question about whether states that understand fully well that they are under the pressure of transnational corporations, they're under pressure of US imperialism and its various subsidiary agents. These countries understand that their way forward is blocked, it's hemmed in, especially now in the pandemic, it's becoming clear to countries. So
Mhm.
some of those older debates, I think, need to come back, and the kind of role that they will play is to reintroduce people to ideas that one mustn't see one interest in the world, benevolent US power trying to make all boats rise. That's simply not the case. That we need a much more realistic understanding of how the world really works than have this sort of idealistic attitude that globalization is going to help everybody. It's not actually. It hurts working class people globally. It helps elites, not globally, but a lot of elites are benefiting from it. So these debates, which had been so important in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, between people who were more involved in the tricontinental and others in the NAM, non aligned movement, these debates need to be back on the table because they have actually a current reality. It's not that we want to look back for nostalgia, but because those debates will help advance our thinking in the present.
And it's been the work of your research institute, the Tricontinental, that I myself and many of my own comrades and people that I'm in in conversation with have been educated about these things and why they're important in this particular moment in time. And as somebody who's an academic, these aren't things that are being talked about in the halls of the academy. And so it's incredibly important to approach them this way, and especially the points that you make about national liberation and movements for decolonization. They often get framed as kind of particular interests or kind of like ethno-nationalist interests in some regards. But in many ways, you reframe those questions and why they pose such a legitimate threat to the kind of capitalist world order is because they actually were espousing universal kind of aspirations for the majority of the planet, right? The poor nations, so to speak. Later on, you kind of covered a little bit about globalization, and how there was a transformation of banks, from tanks. Instead of sending tanks in, it was now the banks, and the role of the other three-letter word, which is the IMF, and versus the CIA, and how that came to really assert kind of U.S. interests within the so-called developing world at this particular moment. But you do something that's really interesting. I think in 1991, you trace the origins of what we now understand are hybrid wars to the kind of first invasion of the United States in Iraq. And you kind of make this point about how asymmetrical war or total war has never been sufficient because it can't win that kind of ideological battle. And after the fall of the USSR, and the kind of the ideological battle continues, and you have Fidel Castro on one side, kind of imploring the world to engage, or the left to engage in a battle of ideas and take up the struggle for communism and socialism within the halls of journalism, within the halls of the academy, while at the same time the United States is really kind of pioneering a new method of war, which you and many others have called the hybrid war. And can you talk about the origins of the hybrid war and its contemporary kind of like implementation in countries like Venezuela, for example, and why Venezuela is in many ways at the heart of the current kind of left internationalism that's being constructed?
Yeah, so it's a very good question, and I mean the importance of it cannot be overestimated. I mean, first thing, hybrid wars, of course, are not new. Most wars have had a range of weapons used. There's the direct, cavalry comes charging in, but there's also ideological wars. Just think back to the wars that took place when the United States expanded so-called westward, into the native nations. They had to paint the peoples of the Americas as savages. They had to say that they were, in fact, the ones attacking the forts. Well, the very existence of the fort wasn't to be called into question. But if you depict people as savages, then it's acceptable to annihilate them. I mean, this is the work that John Locke does in the Second Treatise of Government, where he said, God gave nature to humans to make it into something productive, but the native people of the Americas, they are not able to make this productive. Therefore, we can take the land from them because we have God's right to do so. That's an ideological war. That is a cultural battle against people. So the hybrid war as a concept it's a very old concept. But as technology improved, the importance of the hybrid war increases. Let's look at a war. Once you move to aerial bombardment, you can fly a plane over the actual battle lines and bomb cities in the rear. And then you can disrupt industrial production, you can kill civilians, you can raise the cost of the war to where a government has to surrender. But that changed the nature of war quite dramatically. Just the fact that you can fly a bomb across the actual front line. Now, when you live in a world where things are so much, integrated into digital mechanisms, everything is computerized and it's online and so on. There is a way in which warfare can enter the digital realm, and you can paralyze, power plants by hacking into them and so on. So there is a way in which you have to understand technological developments helping use different kinds of mechanisms to hurt countries. So the general idea of hybrid war, however, is it is a total war rather than merely
Hmm.
a war on a battlefield. A total war means it's a war to delegitimize a country, to make a government find it impossible to govern and therefore surrender. This is before even you fire a shot. You can start diplomatically isolating a government. You can start portraying the government ideologically as monstrous or malevolent in some way. Then you can put enormous economic pressure on the government. This is, of course, even more so in the case when countries are integrated into supply chains. cut off access to the supply chain. If countries were more self-reliant, then the question of an economic embargo would not be so significant. But because there's such high integration, something that the West promoted, it becomes easier to put pressure on a country by slicing it off the supply chain, cutting it off from financial markets, from being able to raise finance for development, for international trade, and so on. So these instruments are utilized for the same end. I mean, why do you send an invading force in? You send an invading force in to get rid of a government, to overthrow the government, and to perhaps capture territory or to capture resources and things like that. If you can do the same thing, if you can attain the same end, overthrowing a government, capturing resources, capturing territory, if you can do all those things without firing a shot, why wouldn't you? And that's
Mm.
exactly what the hybrid war is. I mean, the hybrid war is the utilization of a range of techniques that includes economic warfare, diplomatic warfare, ideological warfare, and so on, to attain the end of either overthrowing a government or subordinating the government and getting access to raw materials, getting access to territory, and so on. So, this is where we are today. And in a real sense, Venezuela is the center point, the epicenter of the hybrid war.
Mhm.
From the emergence of Hugo Chavez onward, the United States and the Canadians have tried to overthrow that government. They used the old coup d'état mechanism in 2002. That failed, and then since then they've developed a very sophisticated process of attempts to delegitimize the government ideologically, diplomatically, throwing them out of this body, that body, cutting them off from the IMF, not allowing them access to their own money, including at the Bank of England, and so on. But really, the essence of it all is using cultural means to delegitimize the government, to call the heads of government like Nicolas Maduro or people that the United States doesn't like, calling them monsters and so on. Let's face one fact. It was Madeleine Albright who, on a national television program in the United States, said that the unnecessary death of 500,000 Iraqi children because of a US sanctions policy was a price worth paying. In other words, she accepted that the Clinton administration was party to the genocidal death of 500,000 Iraqi children. And yet somehow Bill Clinton and Madeleine Albright are not treated as monsters or diabolical. There is no evidence that, let's say Nicolas Maduro, the president of Venezuela, has done anything comparable to that.
Mhm.
No evidence that he's done anything comparable to that. Yet we have Madeleine Albright herself saying that she is responsible for the death of 500,000 Iraqi children. But yet the cultural industry will paint Maduro as a problem and Madeleine Albright as a hero. And that's what we're talking about when we say the hybrid war. It is an instrument of hybrid war to paint certain people or certain processes, certain political movements as malevolent and others as benevolent. That itself is part of the warfare.
And even going as far as to put a bounty, I think it's a $15 million bounty on Maduro's head, as if this is, the Wild West. And that itself has origins within the conquest and the annexation of indigenous territories. We're running out of time, but I wanted to ask a final question. This is something that was sticking out to my in my mind as I was reading this. And this book is written for everyone in the world. I recommend everyone read it. It's a great kind of exhumation of imperialism, and itself is kind of like a zombie that continues to live on and on. But we're seeing it's challenged by the rising kind of socialist powers in the country or in the world, especially with the response to coronavirus and the inadequacies of even a modest or like a minor social democratic reform within the United States to provide something like socialized healthcare. And that's one thing that it's always perplexed me about the left itself in the United States, in particular, is that the U.S. The kind of contradiction of the paradox of U.S. imperialism, I guess, is that the United States has, by and large, accumulated a large chunk of the world's social capital. We are home to the most, billionaires. We have the highest, GDP, et cetera, et cetera. And basically using that surplus, right, to acquire many of the things that the rest of the world simply can't. But there's little redistribution of that social wealth when it comes to things like medicine or even education. And what do you have to say to people, especially in the United States, listening to this, about their own government and its role in plundering these countries and continuing to hold them, under the boot of U.S. imperialism while extracting the wealth from these countries, but not even redistributing it to its own kind of poor classes?
I mean, this is the way in which imperialism functions, frankly. When you look at the pandemic, the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres quite rightly called for a global ceasefire. He said, "No wars. Let's focus on tackling the pandemic." I think was a very sober and correct thing that he said. This is a priority. Let's
Mhm.
stop the spread of the disease, break the chain of infection, and so on. But the United States government, during this period of a pandemic, intensified pressure to overthrow the government in Venezuela. In fact, whether it authorized it or not, there was a kind of invasion, which we in one of our reports jokingly called the Bay of Piglets. That's what they attempted from Colombia into Venezuela. The United States government intensified pressure on Iran. I mean, to the point that the WHO could not find airlines to fly necessary supplies into Iran. And when the WHO representative eventually was fortunate enough to get the UAE military to fly that stuff in. I mean, it's incredible to see how the United States is behaving, trying to say, take the vaccine developments and make it commercial and also only for Americans first. I mean, this kind of anti internationalist attitude is important to highlight. I mean, and on the other hand, of course, we see countries of the global south, including China, say that if a vaccine is developed, it should be in the medical commons. It should be
Mm.
open to anybody to then go and produce for their own countries, for their peoples, and so on. There is a straight line difference between an internationalist consciousness, such as you see from the Cuban people. After all, it's Cuban doctors who've been going around the world, Chinese doctors who've been going around the world trying to help tackle the virus. I haven't seen brigades of American doctors, US doctors anywhere. I mean, have US doctors, they're not even in the United States because there's no public health system.
Mhm.
You don't even have anybody testing you. In Cuba, 28,000 medical students left their dormitories and went and tested the entire population of 11 million people. The entire 11 million Cuban population was tested by its medical students. Country like the United States, there's no capacity to go and test people anywhere. There's no government methodology. They haven't gone and asked medical schools to get involved. Nothing. I mean, it's basically, if you're able and rich, you can survive this. If you're poor and have to go to work and you're collecting garbage and so on, well, you may not survive. And to see the callousness of the government against its own people, I think that, I hope, has at least raised questions for people. I don't have any anticipation that a public immediately says, "Well, I've now, turned hard left," or whatever. But at least questions should be raised. One should not be so blind as not to ask the question: why is it that in Vietnam, which shares a 1,000 kilometer border with China, there have been no fatalities from COVID-19? And why is it that in the United States, in Brazil, in India, this is a runaway pandemic? These are serious questions that need to be asked by people. I don't want to, come in with some heavy-handed answer. I would just like people to ask the question.
Mm. Well, thanks so much, Vijay, for joining us. Can you just tell folks where they can find your book? I know that it hasn't been physically printed, but there are digital copies available, and how they can best, follow your work and where you're at.
Well, I appreciate that. The best place to get the book in English is at Leftword, WORD, leftword.com. The book is available very, very reasonable price as an ebook. can't be
Mhm.
printed yet because in India, our printer is still not online and the supply chains remain disrupted. As soon as that changes, the book will be available in print in English. It is actually out in Brazil from Espresso Popular in Portuguese. They've printed copies, and it will be their book club selection this month. It comes out in Spanish from Battle of Ideas Press in Argentina, and so on. The best way to keep up with the work is to go to thetricontinental.org and to see our regular slate of publications, including a series called Corona Shock, which I think people will find quite interesting.